And maybe we can get everybody back in at the same time, and that'll be great. First, let's go to the Lord in prayer, if we will, before we get started. Father, we thank you again, Father, for many blessings you've given us, Father. Thank you for the opportunity to meet here today, Father, and worship you. Father, I ask you to have your own way today, Father. I ask you to lead me and guide me through the lesson, Father. Keep me on track. Help me say the things that you would want said, Father, and I pray that, Father, you'll just use it in any way, Father, that you feel is best. Thank you again for your many blessings. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Last Sunday, PT talked about, he mentioned that, in Psalm, there's a lot of verses there. You can think of a topic, and a lot of times you'll find a verse or verses in Psalm that covers it. Well, it just so happens the main verse that I want to talk about today comes from Psalm, and it's Psalm 14:1. I have to take my glasses off because I can't see up close without it. But it comes from Psalm 14:1. It says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good." And I think everybody knows it's common sense. Even if the Bible didn't tell us about God, even if we didn't know about God, common sense says you look at here and you know this didn't just happen by accident. You know that somebody had to create it. In fact, even if you go back in the Old Testament, there are a lot of nations there. They didn't worship God, but they did have enough sense to know that somebody created the earth and everything. They worshiped false idols, but they had enough sense to know this didn't just happen. And even later on, you go in, I guess, maybe the 18th and 19th centuries, when people first started going into the jungles in South America and Africa, they ran into people, tribes in there, and these are what I guess you call primitive tribes. Some people might say they were ignorant, but even they didn't worship our God, the right God, but they worshiped something because even they had enough sense to know this earth didn't just happen by accident. They knew that somebody had to create it. And then today, here we have people fall into two main groups. There's the group we fall into. We believe in God. We know that God created the universe, the earth, man, all the living creatures. And then the other group, the ones who don't believe in God, basically they follow evolution, the things that Darwin taught. They believe started as some ooze out here somewhere in a puddle, and somehow through some complicated process he evolved up until he became man. Now, of course, we know that doesn't make sense. Here you have primitive people back in the darkest parts of the jungle who have enough sense to know that this didn't just happen. Somebody created this. And here you have people with PhDs, supposed to be some of the smartest people in the world, I guess, and they believe that all this happened by accident. And if you'll notice, if you listen to them, they'll come up with this complicated process on how this happened. Well, don't get bogged down in all this complicated system, whatever they come up with. A lot of times if a person tries to defend something, if they don't really have a defense for it, they'll try to complicate it, tie it up with a bunch of details. And that's what happens. But it's not that complicated. Let me tell you how simple it is. And if you break it down, I have to break things down to its simplest form to understand anything. I'm not smart enough to understand all these complicated things, so I have to keep it down to where I can understand it. And just to tell you how simple it is, let's say that your child came back from school one day and they said, we were studying about this island out in the middle of the ocean, and there was nothing on the island. There was a bunch of trees, and there was some sand, and right in the middle of this island there's a building. Now, there's nobody on the island, but they got a theory on how this building got there. What they think is that at some point in time there was this huge explosion. Now, there's nothing on the island to explode, but it don't matter. There was this huge explosion at some point in time, and it took a bunch of these trees and it forced them way up into the atmosphere. Now, at that time, there was this thunderstorm going on, and the wind was just really tough and vicious and twirling. And so the way that wind was blowing, it stripped all the bark and limbs off those trees. And the way the wind hit those trees at certain angles, it cut those trees up into perfect two-by-fours. Now, I tell you, I'm telling you, it's not as complicated as they try to make it. If you bring it down to simple terms, it's silly. And I realize this is silly, but I'm just trying to make a point. Well, what they theorize is when those two-by-fours fell back down to earth, they didn't just fall here and there. They actually, probably never happen again. One of those flukes that, don't know how it happened, but this one time, all those two-by-fours fell such that they formed actual walls and a roof on that building. They actually formed that. And not only that, there were actually spaces left where there were window openings. Well, also, it blew this sand up there in the atmosphere too. Well, there's lightning going on. Well, what they theorize is that lightning hit that sand and fused that sand, and it actually formed glass. And not only formed glass, but when that glass fell back down to earth, it was the same size to fit into those window openings. Now, if your child came back and told you that, you're probably going to think, I believe I'm going to go down and have a talk with somebody at that school. I mean, that just don't make a whole lot of sense, does it? Well, let me ask you, what is more complex, a building or this earth? Everything in it, all the living creatures, just having the right amount of oxygen to let us breathe. It's just close enough to the sun that we don't burn up, but it's not so far away that we don't freeze. Everything is just sitting right where it needs to be. Now, these geniuses out there with all these PhDs who believe in evolution, if I was to tell them that I believe that building got there that way, they'd be ready to say, I believe old Randy done lost it here. We might want to just try to keep him calm. Don't let him hurt himself till we get the folks with the white coats and the butterfly nets out. We'll let them take care of him. Well, see what I'm saying? They would say that was silly, but yet they believe something more complex than that can happen the same way, just by accident. But like I say, don't let people complicate things to the point where you lose track of what they're really trying to say. But like I say, there's basically two groups. We believe. I hate to say believe. I'd rather say we know that God created the universe and the earth and everything. And the other group who kind of follows what Darwin came up with, they believe evolution, what they call survival of the fittest. They believe that, the stronger lived and the weaker died off. Survival of the fittest is basically 4 words that basically mean selfishness. Under survival of the fittest, people would basically spend their time, their thing in life would be to take care of do the things that gives them the most happiness and the things that causes them the less hurt. So I got to thinking now, and don't get me wrong, what would the world look like if evolution was true and there was no God? Now, don't get me wrong. We know there's God. Don't get me misunderstand me. This is a what if. Andy Griffith on his program, he'd always say if and that. He's don't interrupt me while I'm doing my ifings. Well, I'm doing a what ifing. What ifing evolution was true and there was no God? Well, what you're going to find out is everything falls in on itself. Nothing can survive. And the first thing is, if there was no God, there are no absolutes. By absolutes, I mean there is no absolutely right, there's no absolutely wrong, there's no absolutely good, there's no absolutely bad. Why is there not? Because there is no one to establish this, what you might call a moral standard. This is a standard. Without God, there is no moral standard. Everything is just an opinion. What one person thinks is good, another person might not think is good. Well, what does it matter? There is no right or wrong. There is no moral standard. One opinion is just as good as another. Let's say there are two people and they're lost in the desert. They got 1 quart of water to share between them. So let's say that during the night, one of the people gets that quart of water and drinks it all. Now, I think everybody would say that would be despicable, right? That'd be wrong. That'd be terrible to do that. That'd be selfish. But if you're in a world where there's no God, what difference does it make? I mean, the person who didn't get the water might think it's wrong, but that's just his opinion. The person who drank the water, hey, I'm just doing survival of the fittest. What's wrong with it? Who is up there to judge me and say that's right or wrong? There is no right or wrong because there wouldn't be a God to determine what's right or wrong. But, excuse me, even an atheist would say that is wrong, because atheists, just like we do, they have a sense of what is right and wrong, but that sense of right and wrong is given to us by God. Atheists like the things that God provides. They just don't like to give credit to who provided that. In fact, atheists have if what atheists believe was true, they have no basis to believe what they do. There is, under their beliefs, there is no right or wrong. An opinion is just an opinion, and one would be just as good as another. Now, the trouble is, too, when you talk about survival of the fittest, people don't act that way. You know, survival of the fittest means I'm going to do what gives me the most happiness and the things that avoid the most pain. Yesterday we had the food giveaway. Well, you know, with no God, why would you have a food giveaway? I mean, would it be better to get up, do that, or maybe I want to lay in bed, drink coffee, watch TV, whatever, you know? That kind of goes against survival of the fittest, doesn't it? Every day you have people with the police department and fire department, they risk their lives to help people who can't help themselves. Does that sound like survival of the fittest? Doesn't to me. You know, we always reading about in times of war where there have been people who will sacrifice their own lives so that other people can live. Survival of the fittest? Doesn't sound like it to me. Does it to you? But anyway, if you talk about survival of the fittest, who suffers in that? The weak are the ones who suffer, right? Well, what does the Bible say about the weak? Romans 15:1 says, "We then that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak and not to please ourselves." 1 Thessalonians 5:14 says, "Now we exhort you, brethren, warn them that are unruly, comfort the feeble-minded, support the weak, be patient toward all men." But the thing is, people do watch out for the weak, which is just more evidence that God does exist, because under evolution, survival of the fittest, there'd be no reason to watch out for the weak. It's, you know, I'm getting all I can for me. It doesn't matter about anything else. And who's to judge? If there's no God, there's no one to judge whether it's okay or not. And also, without God, there would be no love. If you go to 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, it says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. And everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love." God is love, right? All love comes. They believe that people are supreme beings. They believe, like I say, that people evolved up through the stages till they got to the point of being mankind. Well, they don't believe there's anything higher than man. Well, in that case, each person would be free to determine their own moral standards, right? Well, what happens if one person's opinion of what immoral behavior is different from somebody else's? Who's to be the judge? It's just an opinion. Without God, it's just an opinion. And this is going to sound despicable, but this is true. Without God, with no moral standard, did you know that Hitler's opinion would be just as valid as our opinion? if it made him happy to kill 6 million Jews, who's to say it's wrong? I mean, our opinion might be it's not good to do that, but there's no moral standard. With no God, there's nobody to set a standard of what's okay or what's right or wrong. It makes him happy. He's just doing survival of the fittest, doing what's best for him. Again, I know that sounds despicable, but that's the way it would be. And fortunately, well, I say fortunately, I heard that during the Nuremberg trials, one of the defenses that they used was that, well, you just don't understand the beliefs of our society. Those are standard beliefs. But fortunately, the judges said, well, your beliefs of society are not the ultimate decision. There is a overarching power, meaning God, that overrules the beliefs of what your society believes. But again, if with no God, is murder wrong? We know it's wrong. But with no God, to determine a moral standard, it's just his opinion versus someone else's opinion. So how can you really condemn any kind of immoral behavior? There's a professor, William Lane Craig. He's a professor at Houston Baptist University. He made the statement, if moral values cannot exist without God, and moral values do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists. Now, this may sound a little odd to you, but the fact that evil exists is more evidence that God does exist. So how do we know something is evil? We know it's evil because first we know what is good, right? And there's no way to measure what is bad unless there's a good to compare it to. If you saw a crooked line, on a piece, somebody drew a picture of a crooked line, you would know that was a crooked line. Now, you would know that was a crooked line because you know what a straight line looks like. So, but anyway, before we can know something is evil, we have to know the good that the evil perverted or made bad. But and let me get straight here. Don't want to get wrapped around the hub here. But if evil exists, we know evil exists because we have good to compare it to. Okay, the source of all good is God, right? Everybody agrees with that. So the fact that evil exists, we can compare it with good. God is the source of all good. Then the fact that evil does exist is evidence that God exists. I hope I didn't get confusing on that and wrapped around the hub, but just a point. Another thing, without God, there's no hope. You know, if someone passes away, you go to the funeral home, hey, I'm sorry, I wish I could give you some encouragement, but, hey, people live, people die. That's it. It's the best we can do. Can't give you any hope. Fortunately, God does exist. We can give people comfort. But that's what the world would be like if there was no God. There would, if the doctor said, hey, so-and-so's sick, there's nothing we can do for it. There's nothing it can do. There'd be no miracles. Kind of like last Sunday, Miss Sue talked about a miracle that happened in her daughter's life. That doesn't happen without God. But anyway, you can see a world without God would be a pretty gloomy place, wouldn't it? If you go to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 4 through 11, Solomon's talking about, he talked about when he tried all the things. He was trying to get pleasure from the world and the riches and the things that the world offered. But without God, he says it's vanity. And I'll read those verses. He says, I made me great works. I builded me houses. I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards, and I planted trees in them of all kind of fruits. I made me pools of water to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold, and the peculiar treasure of kings and of the provinces. I gat me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men, as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. Excuse me. So I was great and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of my labor. And then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. So that's kind of the picture of what a world would be like without God. You know, Solomon tried these things, not including God in things, and everything was vanity. It's worthless. And that's the way life would be without God. It would be worthless. It'd be a pretty gloomy place to live, I think. Now, there are two questions that atheists like to ask. And they're good questions, I think. The one is, they'll say, if God exists, why is there so much evil in the world? And couldn't God stop the evil that's happening? Well, first of all, why is there so much evil in the world? Well, first of all, we've got to realize the world we live in today is not the same world that God created in Genesis. Genesis 1:31 says, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So God created a perfect world. But the problem is Adam and Eve sinned, and that brought a curse upon the world. Genesis 3:17 through 19. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake, in sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread till thou return unto the ground, for out of it was thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. So after Adam and Eve sinned, the earth was cursed. You know, before that there were no thorns, anything like that. Well, now you had thorns and weeds grow up. So, and he told Adam, in the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat bread. Man, he's going to have to work for his food, and he's going to have to deal with these thorns. Those didn't exist before sin. So after Adam sinned, that brought a curse upon on the earth. So the earth is not the same. The world is not the same world it was that God first created, and that's why that brought sin and death and evil into the world. The other question is, well, couldn't God fix things and stop people from doing evil? And yeah, God's God. He can do anything that he wants to. He could do that, but if he did that, he would have to take away one of the greatest gifts he's given to us, and that's the gift of free will. In Genesis 2:16 and 17, it says, and the Lord commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Now, God didn't particularly use the words free will, but you can see he told Adam, here's what you can eat of, here's what you cannot eat of. If you do eat of it, here's what's going to happen. So he specifically, he gave him a choice. The way he worded that, you can tell that Adam's got a choice, a free will to do whichever. Unfortunately, Adam sinned, and that brought evil into the world. And again, God could remove evil, but in doing that, we would lose the gift of free will. We would basically be like robots. Everything would be pre-programmed on what we're going to do. I guess I've never been in jail, but I guess it'd be kind of like being in jail. I'm pretty sure their days are pretty well pre-planned out. A prisoner can't just go out and do what he wants to. So it'd be kind of like that. We wouldn't have free will and free choice. Now, one thing you find, people who don't believe in God, they don't believe in the Bible either. But, if people would take time and read some things in the Bible, there are things in the Bible that were written thousands of years before these things were even realized by mankind. In Psalms 8:6 through 8, and it's speaking of man, it says, Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, and the fish of the sea, and whatsoever passeth through the paths of the sea. Remember that verse. Now, back in the 1800s, there was a man named Matthew Mowry. He worked for the Department of the Navy in the area that does the charts and everything. Well, he was a Christian. He was familiar with that verse where it talks about the paths of the sea. He was also familiar with what it said in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 6. The wind goeth toward the south and turneth about unto the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to the circuits. So what did he get from those verses? The paths of the sea. He realized there are ocean currents. He's talking about the wind that follows a particular path. He knew there are certain wind currents. He knew that if he could plot those and put those on charts, it would help in their navigation. And he was able to do that, and it did greatly help in navigating the seas. Again, this was written thousands of years before this was even discovered by man. Also, in the 1970 1980 time frame, the government did a study, and what they concluded was that man can live up to a maximum age of 120 years, because they said around that age, the process that allows cells to reproduce, it stops and the body dies. Now, this is a government study. Right away, that tells us this is not cheap. You know, I have no idea what they pay for that study, but I'm sure it was in the thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I don't recall what prices were back in the 1970s and 80s, but I guess for $25 you could have got a pretty nice Bible. I'm just guessing. Instead of spending those thousands, who knows how many thousands of dollars, if they had taken $25 and gone down to the Baptist bookstore, bought them a Bible, and looked up Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, they would have found, and the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man, shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. You know, there's a lot of difference in $25 and thousands of dollars, but that was written in the Bible thousands of years before that was actually discovered by man. And back in up until the middle of the 1800s, doctors, they would do autopsies on dead bodies, and then a lot of times they'd go directly into there to operate on people. Well, at that time, they didn't wash their hands before they'd do the autopsy, wouldn't wash their hands, go ahead and do the surgery. Well, what that happened was you had a lot of people that were operated on, they'd get infections, and some of them would eventually die. Well, once they started washing their hands, these infection and death rates went down. Well, if you go to Numbers 19, verses 11 and 12, again, this is thousands of years before doctors started washing their hands. It says, He that toucheth the dead body of any man shall be unclean 7 days. He shall purify himself with it on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day he shall be clean. But if he purify not himself in the 3rd day, then the 7th day he shall not be clean. So it talks here, about they need to clean, wash themselves before that. If you go on down to verse 18 of the same chapter, you find the first antiseptic is actually found in the Bible. We all buy alcohol, Neosporin, not the drinking kind, isopropyl alcohol, Neosporin, all these antiseptics, peroxide. The first antiseptic's actually in the Bible. Numbers 19, chapter 19, verse 18 says, And a clean person shall take hyssop and dip it in the water and sprinkle it upon the tent and upon all the vessels and upon the persons that were there and upon him that touched a bone or one slain or one dead or a grave. And they found out later that hyssop, 50% of the ingredients in that is it kills fungus, and it also kills bacteria. So that's actually, there's a lot of things in the Bible there that support, like I say, that we didn't find out about till years and years later. But basically, you know, I still go back, if you take God out of the picture, you know, the place falls apart. Well, first of all, wouldn't any of us be here anyway, because there wouldn't have been anybody to create us, right? But even if evolution was possible, everything falls apart. It can't survive. And there are people who still believe that this whole thing can just happen by accident. Now, that building out in the middle of the island, that little simple building, that can't happen by accident, but this whole complex world can. And I am still convinced there are people in this world who are not smart enough to be as educated as they are. We just got some of them. But anyway, that's basically all I've got. And I told them beforehand, I said, you know, the Sunday I have it, you know you're going to get out early, and I can make y'all the same promise Elizabeth Taylor made to each one of her husbands. I won't keep you long. But anyway, that's basically all I've got. But there is so much evidence for God in the Bible, and just looking at the real world, you know, the world couldn't survive without God, because there is no moral standard. You've got to have somebody to establish that moral standard, or you're just talking about opinions. But anyway, anybody got any comments, questions, complaints, anything? All right, well, let's be dismissed then. Father, we want to thank you again for your many blessings, Father. Thank you for letting us meet here today, Father. Thank you for helping me remember what to say today, Father. And pray that you'll just use that, Father, and however you feel is best. Pray that you'll go with us in the remainder of the service today, Father. Just give Brother Jeff the message you'd have him to say. Father, if we have anyone in our midst today, Father, it's lost, pray, Father, today might be the day, Father, that they'll surrender their life to you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.